Okay, and we are live. Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori, and today I'm here with another author interview. I'm so excited about this. I have historical fiction writer Matthew Harffy in my studio today. I'm very excited to talk to you, Matthew. Thank you so much for coming on. If you would be willing to introduce yourself and a little bit about your books for my audience, that would be awesome.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As you said, my name is Matthew Harffy. I'm the author of a series of books called the Bernicia Chronicles, the first of which I will just show off. I'm not going to show them all off, but the first one is The Serpent Sword. They're set in the 7th century, so this first one starts in 633 AD. So as you said, it's historical fiction set in Britain. The Bernicia Chronicle was named Bernicia because the kingdom that they're set in is Bernicia, which is a northern kingdom, which I knew nothing about when I started writing them, but later becomes Northumbria, which was one of the kingdoms, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain. So it's time-wise, it's before the Vikings. It's like 200 years before the Vikings. So it's the Anglo-Saxons after the Romans, before the Vikings, but lots of conflict between the different small kingdoms of Britain and also the indigenous people, the Anglo-Saxons called the Welsh. So the word Welsh actually comes from foreigner, from the Anglo-Saxon. So they're basically, it's very similar. I look at it as a little bit like the sort of a microcosm continental shift, like of the American West. You know, you got the indigenous people getting pushed further west, and the Anglo-Saxons coming in from the east. Well, the same sort of thing happened in Britain, where you got from the east, you have the Anglo-Saxons pushing in, and the native Welsh people, the Britons, getting pushed further into the west, and what becomes Wales, and into the north in Scotland as well. You got the Picts, and I've got another series that I'm writing as well. So there's 9 books, by the way, in the Serpent Sword, the Bernicia Chronicles. The 9th one is just out. It's called Forest of Foes. And I've got another series called A Time for Swords, and this is the first one in the A Time for Swords series, which is set a couple of hundred years later. This is the very dawn of what is known as the Viking Age.
Okay.
So 793. This starts with the attack on Lindisfarne, which is the historic beginning of the Viking Age. And the story behind this one is this is written in first person, and it's written from the perspective of a monk called Hunlaf, who is there he's there on the island when the monastery is attacked, but he doesn't turn the other cheek as most of the monks did and get killed. He decides to fight back. And he then brings together a motley crew of warriors to defend another monastery that is going to be attacked by
you just Vikings. Said a whole bunch of my buzzwords in one sentence. The motley crew and a warrior monk. I'm here for it.
Yeah, and so that's the series I'm writing. Well, I'm writing the 2 series on and off, like one, what's the word, alternating between them. Yeah, which is sort of a rod for my own back. So I've just released the 9th one, Forest of Foes of the Bernicia Chronicles. I'm just before we talked, I'm just sort of doing the edits of the 3rd one of this Hunlaf series, the 3rd one, which will be called A Day of Reckoning. The sequel to A Time for Swords is A Night of Flames. So you've got a Time for Swords, A Night of Flames, and then A Day of Reckoning. And there may well be more of those. Who knows?
How many books do you plan on having in the Bernicia Chronicles?
The Bernicia Chronicles. So far I've got 9. I've already got a synopsis for book number 10. That's already contracted. So
nice.
I'll be writing that. I think not this year, probably 2024. And I'm not 100% sure. Possibly 2 or 3, 4 more, something like that. It's around the sort of 13, 14 mark, but there could be more, I guess. If there's plenty of scope to add in extra ones. I could even go back, and there's gaps of time when 6 years have gone by and nothing's happened, in theory. So I could slot in extra bits. But as it's gone chronologically, it started with this character Bearbrand, starts off at 17 years old in the first book. in this 9th one, he's 36, 37, something like that.
Okay.
He's already
so it follows the
just
same
about to,
character all the way
yeah,
through.
yeah, yeah,
Cool.
that's right. Yeah. So he's
Cool.
a fictional character, but his life is intermingled with all of the real characters.
Yeah.
And he's a father now. He's actually, I think he's just about a grandfather. If he isn't already, he might just about become a grandfather at the old age of 36. So he's beginning to feel a bit a bit long in the tooth. But yeah, there's still plenty of stuff for him to. He's at the moment he's on a pilgrimage to Rome, accompanying cool. Wilfrid, who's a real character, is a real historical character who goes to Rome, who becomes a saint, but he becomes a bishop. And at the moment he's a young monk that Bearbrand has been sent to accompany to Rome. And so the book number 9, Forest of Foes, is him traveling through France. I thought they were going to be in Rome, but they never get to Rome. Book number 9, it's just all in France. So that's Merovingian France and the shenanigans that go on there with the Queen of France and of one of the French kingdoms.
Cool.
So
yeah, awesome. So when you're mentioning that you thought it was going to be, they're going to get to Rome. So when you're writing, and this is totally off script because I'm curious.
Yeah.
Do you plan out exactly where each book is going, or do you just kind of start with a general idea and then see where it goes?
So I think I've just answered that question. Is that I sort of plan generally where it's going, and I kind of think. I mean, I found the other day a bit of paper that sort of says book 9, travel to Rome, book 10, battle of so and so, book 11. I've sort of got very high, maybe 3 bullet points, like so and so dies or something. Very sort of high level things, because it's based around historical events, and so there are kings and queens, and I want them to, certain events to happen.
Yeah.
But then when I actually sit down to write, so book 9, I then plan out in advance that book in detail when I get there. So I'm a planner when I get to the actual writing stage of the book. So I've got a very high level idea. So I know he's going to go to Rome. When I thought about that, I didn't really know anything about France at that period of history. So to Rome, maybe there'll be mention of them traveling through France or something. But as soon as I started investigating Wilfrid, I started reading about that he stopped in France and things happened, and then there was a queen, and I started looking up this queen. That supposedly Balthild, this queen, was an Anglo-Saxon, and she was originally a slave who then became the queen. I was like, that sounds amazing. What? And then I thought, so this sounds too interesting to pass up. And I started investigating a bit more, and there's stuff about then there was some sort of uprising, and Wilfrid was involved, and there was all these things happening. It's like intrigue around the ecclesiastical people. There were bishops and things like revolting against the royal family. I thought, wow, there's got to be a story there. And so it happens to be just within like about a 2-year window of this traveling, to Rome. And so I thought, well, I've just got to put it all in. So that just spiraled into a whole book, which I then planned and wrote that whole book. And then the next book is almost certainly going to be about Rome. I mean, I've written the synopsis, so unless I go completely crazy now, I normally don't do a synopsis, but for this time, when I just signed a few months ago, I signed another 3-book deal. And I actually wrote a synopsis for all 3 books, which I've never done before, and it felt very strange. So I wrote the synopsis for the 3rd Time for Swords book, A Day of Reckoning, that I'm just finishing now. I've written the synopsis for this 10th Bernicia Chronicles book, and I've written a synopsis for another book, which is the book I'm going to start next month, basically.
Okay, and that's a completely new.
That's something new, yeah.
Okay, so you're going to be working on 3 series all at the same time.
Well, I don't know if that was. I'm not sure that's going to be a series. That's pitched as a standalone.
Okay.
But obviously, like everything, it could have legs.
Sure.
I suppose if it
kind
does fantastically well.
Options.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And of course, I've got the standalone that I've written that you've read, which is in the background, there, which is Wolf of Essex, which I can see.
I cannot wait to talk about it. I'm a pretty major historical fiction reader. I always have been. I love historical fiction, and especially because, my main genre being fantasy, it's so broadly inspired by history oftentimes. And so I think it's really fun to kind of alternate a little bit. And I usually try to get in quite a few historical fiction books throughout the year. I wanted to grab a couple of comments. Totally agree with this. Yep. Love it. because that's a fun kind of trope subversion where, you know, you expect these monks to kind of, you know, just put their heads down, and I love that'll be on my TBR as soon as we're done talking, because I would love to.
I mean, yeah, I mean, without giving too much away, most of the monks, you know, don't do very well. You know,
yeah, but we got one.
But he finds out that he's slightly different. He's maybe not cut from the same cloth as the rest of them. And I'm very clear in that I mentioned it in the note, the author's note at the end, that the inspiration behind there is obviously the history of the time and the attack on Lindisfarne and everything, but it's very much a nod to, or an homage to, Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven. So it's very much, I mean, there's, you know, a couple of the reviewers don't seem to have got, or I mean, not the reviewers, but people like on Amazon don't seem to have read the historical note or the author's note and sort of realized that I've owned up to it. And they're like going, this is so blatantly a copy of Seven Samurai. And so, yes,
but
I know.
Monks in the early British Isles period. I'm here for that. I love it.
Yeah. So it's a trope of the small motley crew, you know, fighting against a bigger, stronger force.
Yeah.
And it ends up with, you know, him pulling together this group of motley crew.
Yeah, love that. Megan's had to run, but he wanted to say hi, and I know he was very excited that I was going to have you on, so I'm sure he will be reading. I'm not sure what he has on his TBR, but
Okay.
Patricia, she's another historical fiction writer friend of mine.
Hello.
And yeah, that was something I was thinking about when you were mentioning your story while they're traveling through France, is just when you start going into history, it's a rabbit hole. Like, there's so many things that you discover and pop up that you didn't even know about. And I can imagine writing a historical fiction, there's endless opportunities of what paths you could take and what direction your characters could go and things you can include. And I know with Wolf of Wessex, you kind of, and I think I remember reading that you said there was enough of an opening where you could really put in a lot of the, you know, fiction kind of details within this historical setting. So how do you decide what, like, I have this question on here, how do you find that balance of fiction and history? Like, how much of each do you try to aim for, if there's any kind of approach to that?
Yeah, well, I think the writing in a historical world, you want the details of the world to be real. So I think you want that to be as authentic as possible.
Right.
I think within that context, you've got different types of book. You've got some books which are completely fiction, in that they don't refer to any event that happened in real life that we know of. So it's just a story that could potentially be in any time in history, but it's placed into that historical world.
Yep.
And that's fine. Mine tend to have, and my A Time for Swords series is more like that, in that it starts off with this historical event, this attack on Lindisfarne, but then later on it diverges from that, and the world itself is authentic. So the kings they mention are real, and everything, all the technology they use, and you know how they go about building a ship, and you know all the things they do is all authentic, and what the monks are doing, and the scriptorium, and the name, you know, the books that they have there, and all this sort of stuff. All of that is historical, but the rest of it is all fiction. So it's, as I said, it's this sort of Magnificent Seven kind of thing, which never really happened as far as we know. So I've just made it all up. But within that realistic, that authentic world. So I always want to get that authentic world feel.
Set the stage.
Then the Bernicia Chronicles, and I suppose the Bernicia Chronicles are the ones that I started with, and it's probably where I sort of got the pattern for how I do it. Is I find sort of historical events that are almost like tentpole events that I can then hang a story on. So there's not a lot of stuff written about 7th century Britain. So you've got the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and you've got Bede's History of the English Church and People, with Venerable Bede. And so both of those things have quite a lot of, Bede has got quite a lot written about the 7th century, because it was just 50, 60, 80 years before he was born, or before he was around. So he was writing, he was interviewing people that were contemporaries of the action, and he was like saying, and so the king said this and he did that. So I'll take some of those ideas and I'll then expand on them and put in the fictional characters around that. in Wolf of Wessex, it was similar in that I found really just a couple of lines in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that referred to an attack in Cornwall. And I live in what was old Wessex. It's not called Wessex anymore now. It's Wiltshire, but it's part of Wessex. So Wessex was this part of the world, so the southwest. So it's all sort of quite near to me. And I thought I want to write something a bit closer to home. And so I found this talk of this Viking attack in Cornwall, that the Anglo-Saxons from Wessex, or the men of Wessex, had gone and fought them back and fought them off. And it said something in the Chronicle. It says something about the fact that the Vikings, or the Danes, or whatever, the Norse, had sided with the men of Cornwall and then gone off to fight the men from Wessex. Because the men from Cornwall, you got this word, this Cornwall. The Wal is also from the Walish. It's the foreigner again. The people getting pushed into the west. So these are there's still quite a bit of enmity in the 9th century between the Cornish and the men of Wessex, who are like the new Anglo-Saxons that have come in and taken over. And I thought, well, how have these two groups of people, the Danes and the Cornish, how have they come together and planned to fight? There must have been some messages, there must have been some communication. What happens if that communication falls into someone else's hands, and that sort of sparks the story? But in terms of the history and story, my mantra is always story over history. So the story is absolutely paramount. If the story needs something slightly unhistorical to happen to make the story work better, I'll fudge the history to make the story work better, but I'll own up in the historical note or the author's note at the end and say, this is what I did. But I think people reading it want to enjoy the story first and foremost. And then you can go and investigate research yourself if you want to go and find out, where I've changed things. I'll tell you, but you can go off and look in more detail.
Well, and I think that's how we, bring history to life. That's how, as people, how we relate to past, is the stories of the lives, because we can try to, pick out pieces that we can relate to. And one of the things that drew me to Wolf of Wessex as my first read of yours was that it was pitched to me as a murder mystery set in 800 AD British Isles. And I remember thinking, I don't know that I've read anything in that time period. Why not? I have no idea, there's all the Viking stuff, like you said, and there's all the Roman stuff. And where's that in between era, as you said, kind of gets swept under a little bit because, everybody's so focused on the Vikings and the Romans. And I was like, a murder mystery, but okay, I'm here for that. And then I had no idea what to expect. I went into it really blind. And I love a reluctant hero so much. And so Dunstan was perfect for what I was looking for to read. I absolutely loved it. So I want to talk a little bit about Wolf of Wessex specifically. And one of the things that I really appreciate in books in general is a contrast of POVs or protagonists. And I think we can safely say that you have a extremely contrasting set of protagonists in Wolf of Wessex. So how did you approach writing Dunstan, who is the older, reluctant hero character, versus Edwin, who is, a young coming of age story? What was the process like creating both of them?
So, probably not as sort of scientific as you'd like it to be, or maybe as it should have been.
I'm just here for the story. That's all I care about.
So I started writing the story in the late summer of 2018.
Okay.
When we were on holiday in the Lake District in the north of the UK, me and my wife and my youngest daughter, who was a teenager then, and she's now 19, and my eldest daughter's 23. So I've got two daughters, both when I was writing that were teens. So I pulled very heavily on the fact of the teenage behavior, which was...
It's very authentic.
It wasn't that difficult because I had two teenage girls, at home. And I remember one review that came out when the book just had been released. from a female reviewer, and she said, she enjoyed the book and everything. And then she said, but I didn't like the female character because she cried too much. And I'm a woman, and when I was 15, I didn't cry all the time. And I thought, well, you didn't, but my daughters cried all the time. I was like, well, they're always crying about everything. And to be honest, if I'd just been dismembered and murdered in the forest, and then they were running through the forest getting chased by bad guys, I think they'd be crying a bit.
I would hope.
I would cry. I'm 51 now, and I'd be crying. I mean,
yeah.
So it was quite. The story itself was all completely, set in the early 9th century, very different to me. But in a way, it was a little bit autobiographical. It was me. I was in my late 40s. We just got a dog called Blue, who's now 4.5 years old, nearly 5 years old, and he is a Merle Border Collie Poodle cross. So he's gorgeous, fluffy thing, thinks he's a wolf. He thinks he's like a savage wolf, but he's like, he's about 30 pounds. He's like a small dog, he's not a big guy. Gets very fluffy. Have to cut his hair.
And then he gets very small.
yeah, exactly. Very skinny there. And so I was walking him through the fields with aches and pains of a late 40-year-old person, dodgy knee or whatever, walking around with my dog and thinking, well, I'm not a warrior, but maybe I could just write about a warrior who's a bit old and not maybe at his prime, with his dog, teenage girl. It all just fell into place. And the idea of doing this sort of the dual point of view, so having one chapter from the Dunstan's perspective, one from Edwin, and just sort of flipping from one to the other, that was because I'd recently read, I'm trying to remember his name now, Toby Clements. Has got a series of books called The Winter Pilgrims. I think the first book is called. And I think there's 4 books, and it's set in the time of the Wars of the Roses, I think it is.
Sure.
And it's really, really, really good. I don't normally end up reading every book in a series. I often get bored, before if they don't really capture my attention. And this one, I read the whole thing, all 4 books. It's fantastic. So, and he has 2 characters, and they're probably affected me more than I realized, because of course I went on to write about a monk, but he's got 2 characters. One's a monk and one's a nun, and they both are fleeing, and they end up sort of joining forces, and they end up becoming romantically entwined, I guess, as the story goes on. They have lots of adventures, but it's very historically accurate, but it does this perspective change. So each chapter forwards the story, but it's in her perspective, and then it's in his perspective, and it goes on. You don't go back and retell the story again from the other person's perspective. It's always moving along. So I decided to do the same thing. Yeah. And so, the chapter will finish at 5 o'clock for one person, and the next person picks it up at just after 5 o'clock. So it's always carrying on. You're never going back and kind of reliving what's happened before. And I found it really interesting. With each book, I try to do something that I haven't done before to kind of stretch myself, and I hopefully make it interesting for me as well as the readers. And so that was me kind of saying, the Benicia Chronicles are multi-point of view. So I'll have Bearbrand is the main character, but there's several other characters that have point of view chapters. So I've done that, and that works well, and it's easy to do. Then the Hunlaf stories are first person, which is much more difficult, I found, to write in first person, because it's so immediate. It's so easy to make it not feel authentic. It to feel sort of unbelievable, that I don't know, it's difficult. You're always in the head of the person, so everything has to be somehow explained. If they're not there in the room, how do they find out about what's happening? So and then in between, I did The Wolf of Wessex, which is the 2 points of view, and that's and in terms of how to differentiate them, I just imagined what it was like, what it would be like for my daughter or someone of that age to live it, and what it would be like for me if I was tough. Because I'm not tough, but what would I be like if I was a tough warrior guy and had a few aches and pains and was a bit grumpy and depressed and whatever. That's not really me, but just and I always write chronologically as well. So I didn't write the whole of the book from one character's perspective and then insert the others. I just wrote chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and so all the time. And when I was doing the edits, my editor said that they wanted me to add an extra chapter, and an extra scene. And I said, well, I can't just have one chapter. I'm going to have to add 2 chapters because I have to write one from Edwin's perspective and one from his perspective. So I was like, don't tell me to add too many. But
yeah, well, it was really cool because I think one of the things that does for the characters is it adds so much more depth, because you're not only seeing, Dunstan's point of view, but you're also seeing him from Edwin's point of view.
Yeah.
And that just adds a whole new layer to each character, because, when you're in first person, one of the things that can be tricky is not only do you have to figure out how to get information in that they might not be present for, but it's also, you're running into a little bit of unreliable narrator. Well, how do you, this is just their perspective. How do you know what's actually going on as a whole? And so it was fun to see Edwin having this very purposeful thought about things. And this is, and Dunstan just, she's a teenager, and it was a really good way to show both sides, I think. So I think it worked really well.
No, thank you. And I think it's good to be able to have that kind of be able to comment on the other person, but without them commenting to the person in the book. So, Edwin could go away and think, wow, this guy's really grumpy. Why is he such a scumbag or whatever? But the other guy, Dunstan's thinking that he's, doing the right thing. And, so they can each think about the character without telling that character. Because if it's in first person, written in first person, you kind of have to have a character tell the other person that they're being an ass. You have to say, you're behaving really badly, because otherwise they'll never know.
Right.
But in this case, you can have the person, Edwin can think, wow, he's behaving really badly, but not tell him. So you can, as the reader, you could think, okay, so she gets that he's behaving like a dick, but he doesn't necessarily.
Right. He's got a very, I'm doing the right thing because reasons. Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, and I think this is a really interesting question that I want to go into a little bit. You mentioned, when you have a big series, and this is kind of harkening back to Bernicia a little bit, when you have a big series like that, how do you keep readers invested throughout 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 books? Plus, how do you tell a story, especially when you're working with the same character, which I think can be both a blessing and a curse, because people I really like this character and I'm happy because I get to keep going on with his life. But how do you keep your readers invested over that long of a period of time?
So I think it's really important that each book is a standalone story. I think that's probably the first thing. I don't like it when series are like to be continued. They end the story and it's and the door opens and then what's happened next, buy the next book to find out. Because the chapters can be like that in the book. That's great because it helps drive the narrative and people want to find out what's the next, so that becomes a page turner. But I don't like the idea of not resolving the main conflict within a novel. So I think that's the first thing. So I think each story has to be a standalone. I think you could pick up the Bernicia Chronicles in any order and read them. I mean, obviously there'd be certain things that would be not as the payoff wouldn't be as good because you wouldn't have had some of the background, but I think you could still read. In fact, I know you could still read them in any order, and that each story would have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you'd have the resolution. So I think that's important. But in terms of making people want to come back, I think it's having an interesting cast of characters around the main character, and also have some growth. So lots of people have commented about how much Bearbrand has grown in the series and changed, which I think is really important, because I think in some books you read the Jack Reacher novels, and I really like the Jack Reacher novels. I know they're not fantasy or historical fiction, but I really like the books until the last couple, which are kind of slightly going off the boil, totally going off the boil, because Lee Child stopped writing them. But but in those, the main character, Jack Reacher, doesn't seem to change at all. He's pretty much the same character in book 22 as he is in book 1. Yeah. And that works in a sort of the James Bond Jack Reacher style. For my books, there is a growth to the character. So he starts off as a late teen, a guy in his late teens, which is a young adult. But it's not a YA book, the first one. I mean, it's quite full on. I mean, there's lots of stuff there that you wouldn't want in a YA book maybe, but he grows up, things happen, and it's how he interacts with the people around him and how those, he gets married and he has, family and other things are happening around him. And in one of the later books, again, trying to do something a bit different, or I split the narrative, and I had one of the main side characters have like a whole side quest. So it was like for a long part of it, you're alternating chapters going one place and then Bearbrand, flipping it was, but it was funny because I think in the very first edition, I even got the names wrong in one chapter because I write chronologically, I think. And so someone, loads of people, when it came out, I got loads of emails saying, you know what, in chapter 17 or something, you've got Bearbrand there. He's not supposed to be there. It's someone. I was like, no, it's not Bearbrand. I just wrote Bearbrand because I'm so used to writing Bearbrand, and nobody had picked it up in any of the proofreads or anything.
Authors are human too. What?
Yeah, I know. God, who'd have thought it? But anyway, so yeah, and then I bring them all back. So I'm sort of trying to sort of change the narrative. Interestingly, whenever I try and do something like that, you'll get some people that will say, some of the reviews of that will say, "Oh, I love that. That was great." Other, I really like that other character's storyline. Others say, "Oh, I hated that book because I didn't like the fact that you split the narrative." So it's a difficult thing. And so, one book will have more. I did introduce sort of a bit of a romance theme in one. So I'll sort of introduce different themes and different ideas to try to sort of push the narrative in slightly different directions to make it interesting, as much for me as for the reader. I think, if I get to the point of thinking, well, I've already written this fight scene before, it feels like I've written this before, how do I make it a bit different? So I'm always trying to think of different ways of tackling everything, and they always end up with fights and battles and things. So it's trying to find new ways of approaching them.
Yeah, well, I mean, you had an answer on your Goodreads page about telling the stories you really want to read as an author. And I think, the readers, you're never going to be able to please everybody, right? Because like you said, one person will absolutely love first person, the next person will hate it, and, vice versa. So I think it's really important for us as authors to be able to put in the things that, like, if you love a Motley Crue, write about it, and making sure that it's a fun process for you as an author, because that will translate into the book for the readers that are really enjoying it, I think. So yeah, I appreciated when I went on your Goodreads and I saw that. I was like, I say that to people all the time.
People say write what you know.
Yep.
But I don't think that's very good advice. I think it's
like.
You write what you like. Yeah, write what you like. And if people have written to me and said, "Oh, how do you write so well?" I mean, a few years ago, somebody said, like, "How do you write so well about horses and stuff? Have you done lots of horse riding?" I was like, "Well, I did, like, I don't know, a few hours of horse riding as a kid. I haven't ridden for years and years and years." And I honestly replied and said, "I just watched lots of westerns." And you're just observant, and you just sort of think about what it's like, and and use your imagination, really.
Right.
And so you don't need to be a fantastic horse rider to write about horse riding. You don't need to be a swordsman to write about sword fighting. It's all just about using your imagination and trying to make it as authentic as possible.
Right. Well, and I think, write what you know oftentimes gets twisted as, like you said, you having been like a, reluctant warrior hero from British Isles, but you're bringing in what you know about where you were at in life at that point and your daughters. And so you're kind of weaving both in at the same time. And I think that's a good combination to make it a really fun reading experience.
Yeah, incidentally, it makes me think about Wolf of Wessex. I dedicated to my daughters, actually. And,
I saw that.
Neither of them have read it. my eldest is now reading a lot, and she started reading it, but it's just not her kind of thing. I think she likes sort of urban fantasy and romance, different sort of style. But she did read a bit, and she did say she messaged me and said, this is like a few months ago, and she said, like, "Dad, I read the first chapter of Wolf of Wessex, and the main character Dunstan is just you. It's like with a grey beard. It's like he's looking at the mirror and he's got like a grey beard and stuff." I was like, "Yeah, okay, yeah, this is you kind of got it."
So. Yeah. Well, it's just another stamp of authenticity, right?
That's right.
Patricia says, write what you want to read because someone out there wants to read what you want to read too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree.
Kind of jumping back into Wolf of Essex for a minute. So when you're deciding how to write and which characters to pull from, and you might have kind of spoken to this a little bit already, but what made Dunstan and Edwin the right characters to tell the story? Because you mentioned, knowing about this battle that happened or this attack that happened, and that there's messengers, and, you could have told it from the perspective of the rulers of either side or the messenger or, what have you. So what made you decide to go the route of Dunstan and Edwin?
I don't know, really. I'm not sure. I can't remember the spark that made me make that decision.
Yeah.
But the more I sort of thought about it, I mean, I ended up almost pitching the story to myself. I literally sat down one day. I remember it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. Nobody else had woken up. We're in this holiday cottage in the Lake District. It's a beautiful area of England. And I sat there with a pen and paper and just wrote like the first page. And it sort of just came to me. And I think, and it was from Dunstan's perspective and him kind of just being talking about the forest and the mist and stuff. And I was probably looking out of I could see the lake and there's forests and it's just misty, and it's very evocative of that sort of. And I think originally I was going to write it was going to be in autumn because it was like late summer, and it was only when I started researching that I realized that this historical event that I wanted then to sort of put it all around, which I hadn't had that idea until later, was actually in sort of midsummer. So I had to bring everything forward and change the dates around and everything. But yeah, I don't know. I like there's other characters that I think are. I pitched it to myself a little bit as I was going.
Yeah.
As I don't know if you've read David Gemmell's Legend.
I have it on my shelf. I have been told by everyone.
Okay. So the character in that is called Druss.
Yes.
Okay. And he has a big axe.
Yes.
So has Dunstan.
Yes.
And he is known as his name, one of his nicknames, Druss, this is the axeman of legend. One of his nicknames is Deathwalker. And the axe in Wolf of Wessex is called the Athengenger, which is Deathwalker in Old English.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's a bit of a
sort
nod.
of pitched it to myself as this is Druss meets True Grit meets Rambo.
Yep, I can see that.
In the Viking Age.
I love that. Yeah.
So it was kind of, I started sort of piecing together bits of ideas from other, places that and this whole thing, I think I'd read recently around that sort of time. I love a Western. I've basically come to the conclusion that all of my books are Westerns just set in a different period. And so it is a Western. I mean, there's a sheriff in it because Shire Reeve is the sheriff. So I started to think, I think I read True Grit just recently around that time, and I loved it. It's a fantastic story. If you haven't read it, it's very short, really, really good. And it's written from the perspective of the girl in it.
Okay.
And I think it was that probably that made me think, okay, I've got the older warrior kind of character, the nod to Dunstan, to Druss. I like the idea of this sort of reluctant hero getting pulled back. And he was once great, but now he's not. In fact, the name Dunstan and the Dunstan the Bold is his nickname in the story. That actually comes from a Dungeons and Dragons character of mine from years ago. It was a dwarf who was called Dunstan the Bold, and he was called Bold because he'd had something had happened in the story that someone else called him the Bold, and it's like a running gag in the Wolf of Wessex that a few times people say to him, "Oh, you're Dunstan? Are you the Dunstan, Dunstan the Bold?" And people are like, yeah, and they go, "Why is he called the Bold?" And nobody ever says. So you never find out what it was. He's like, that's a long story. We don't go into that. So
well, I just added True Grit to my Goodreads TBR, so I will definitely check it out.
And it's really short. It's like 150 pages. I mean, it's a very short novel, but very, very good. I mean, the films are great too, but if you haven't seen the films, but the book is really good. And I think if you read the book, you'll then realize you'll probably see lots of similar. I didn't go back and sort of read it again, but I think the spark of that sort of idea of what it's like to that teenage girl's perspective is very much.
Well, and I think too, another, when with telling it from Dunstan and Edwin's point of view, that you're giving kind of that, how does history and the major events of history filter down and affect those who are just living their lives in a village? How does that affect from the bottom all the way up? And
and at the beginning, I kind of thought that Dunstan was going to be kind of a nobody, and in the end, I was a bit annoyed with myself as I was progressing because I realized more and more I was kind of pushing it. It sort of starts off as this whodunit, like you said, and it kind of it progressed and it increasingly became more like a Bernicia Chronicles story towards the end, where it's kind of pulling in different sort of elements and there's a bit more action and stuff. And I could feel it happening as I was writing it and thinking, well, it kind of worked and it all just sort of went there. and then he's got some sort of connections to royalty and things, and
Right.
he and all of those things, and it's sort of like I hadn't meant it to be that at the
But he's
beginning.
kind
It
of
kind of
like
evolved.
it mingled in with, the smaller village, and Edwin just being the
Absolutely, yeah,
daughter of a
yeah.
poor trader, and I'm trying to remember the name of the group that he meets in the forest.
Oh, well, they're wolf heads, aren't they?
He,
So they're I don't know what I call them in the book, but they're
but
basically
he
outlaws.
had that group of friends that he went, and so like you had like multiple
Also,
perspectives.
so they're basically the wolves of Wessex, aren't they?
Yeah.
I can't I can't remember.
well, whoever they are, I thought like that was a cool. You're giving us, because Dunstan is trying to be a nobody at this point, and so he's kind of intermingled with a lot of the everyday people that are, in the village and in the woods, and like he does have these connections that we see later on, but it doesn't start that way. So I think it was a fun, for me at least as a reader, it was a really fun way to kind of get a little bit of both sides, because through the book we see, here's the actions that are going on at the top, and here's the actions that are, the effects of what's going on down, in the villages and
Yeah,
stuff.
there's kind of that threat of Vikings as well, and they keep thinking that when there's murders, they keep thinking, oh, maybe it's the Vikings that have done this, because there is this threat of the warriors and Vikings raiding, and
Right.
there's Dunstan remembers different battles that he was in the past against Vikings and also against other kingdoms, and those are historical. I'm not so sure about the Viking one, but the battles against Mercia or against Northumbria and things, the real battles that took place that he was supposedly in.
Yeah.
And so, one of the options I've sort of thought about is I could write a prequel story. In fact, there's a possibility, I guess, depending on how many of the Hunlaf novels I write, that Dunstan and Hunlaf's lives cross over, because Hunlaf, I'm in 796 now in the third book.
Okay.
And Dunstan, that book is 830 something. So there's possible that an old Hunlaf could meet a young Dunstan. There's definitely a moment there. So
yeah. Well, I think about that too, even with the fantasy world that I'm working in. Like once you have that world in your head, there's so many different ways you can overlap it and explore different time periods. And especially with, historical fiction, you can pull from so many different sources, I would assume, to kind of pull that together. So we kind of talking about like the early, 800, 700 ADs, are there historical periods outside of that you can see yourself going into and writing about at some point?
Yeah, I think probably any period really, but I quite like the sort of the high not fantasy, the high medieval period. High fantasy is the same sort of thing. So basically, the 13th century, the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, that sort of period. The big guys in shining armor and all that sort of stuff. The Crusades and the 100 Years' War and those that sort of period. I can imagine maybe writing about that. I think that plays to my kind of background of playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it's that sort of. Well, I've also thought about writing fantasy. I mean, I haven't had the time and actually written fantasy. I would really say that my books are pretty much like fantasy, but set in the real world. So it's like fantasy without dragons or
historical
whatever. But
fantasy,
really,
sort of,
and the people in the stories, because it's very early medieval, they all believe in goblins and elves and dragons and stuff. So at least nominally they believe in spirits and things like that as well. So you'll sort of get that undertone of the second book in the Bernicia Chronicles is called The Cross and the Curse. And there's a curse placed by a witch on Bearbrand, and he believes it. So everything bad that happens to him afterwards, he thinks, man, this is because I'm cursed. This is awful. And who knows, because the curse is that he's going to die alone, and he hasn't died yet, so maybe it's true. We'll find out. We'll find out how his curse ends. But in terms of actual specific places in history or times, well, I've said I'm going to write this standalone this year. That's in a different time and a different place, and it's going to be closer to you. So it's going to be on the other side of the Atlantic.
Ooh.
And much later in history.
And that one's coming out when-ish?
Well, that will be coming out 2024, I guess. I've got to finish it by October this year. So that'll be published in sort of spring early summer, late spring, or something, 2024, I think.
Okay.
But as yet untitled.
Sure.
But I have got a synopsis for it.
Nice. So we know that it's on my side of the Atlantic, and that's all we're going to get for now.
And it's later in history as well.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Very cool. Well, I'll keep an eye out for that. I'm very interested in getting into Time of Swords too, because I'm invested already. I'm excited. That'll probably be my next one that I'll pick up. So what about historical fiction specifically drew you into writing that genre? Is that just something that you've always read and loved, or was it something that you wanted to have? You know, I know a lot of historical fiction writers like the fact that they have some guidelines and some, you know, borders and things to start with. So what draws you into that genre specifically?
Yeah, I think, as I said, I really like fantasy. I've read lots of fantasy as a kid, and lots of historical fiction too. I think often the bits of the fantasy novels that I like least is the sort of the real high fantastical elements. So the magic and the sort of, you know, I like sort of Game of Thrones. It's all great when it's all dirty and gritty, but as soon as there's dragons flying around, I get a bit like, oh, really? It's like, but I don't hate it. But I think I sort of gravitate towards the more, and the more sort of realistic, in inverted commas, side of sort of the fantasy world. And so I think even if you sort of look at the Dungeons and Dragons campaigns that I still play with a friend who lives in Spain. I used to live in Spain.
Nice.
We play online together, and we've been running like a campaign, just the two of us, for like about 30 years. It's ridiculous.
Nice.
But there's lots of fantasy elements, but it's very sort of gritty. I don't know. It's much more gritty than sort of high. I don't know. It is high fantasy. I don't really know, but I think it's that. Yeah. So I think those things have sort of played into it. And specifically, I read Bernard Cornwell's Arthurian novels. I don't know if you've read those. The Warlord Chronicles. So the Winter King and Excalibur and whatever they're called.
Yeah, and I haven't read them yet, but those are like huge favorites.
They are amazing. So
they're
Legend,
on my TBR.
Legend, that if you read Legend and those three and Lonesome Dove, if you haven't read that by Larry McMurtry.
I've seen the TV show and I want to read the book because it was incredible.
Honestly, you read those things, if you read those, that's it. Then you know everything that's made me who I am as a writer.
That's awesome.
So basically they so the Warlord Chronicles are these Arthurian stories, but they're told in a way that there is magic, but there's not magic. I mean, it's like it's as if it's in the real world,
right on the border.
Everybody believes in magic, but is there really magic? You know, I don't know. Right. I mean, Merlin goes outside where and says, "Oh, I will cast a spell to bring fog, and we will escape under the cover of darkness in the fog, or whatever." And then, lo and behold, a fog comes like 2 hours later after he does a bit of a dance or something. And you think, well, that's not really magic, is it? He's just looked out and worked out that it's going to be foggy, and so it's that kind of thing. And that was really the inspiration that made me start writing, I think, the Bernicia Chronicles back. I started the first one in 2001.
Okay.
And those books came out in the late 90s. And I'd written about 25,000 words of the first of the Serpent Sword. And then I sort of fell into this sort of historical fiction genre just because I was kind of inspired a little bit by the book, but then by these books. But then also I saw a documentary about Northumbria. And Bamborough Castle, and I used to live up there as a kid, and it sort of I thought, oh yeah, I could write about that period, and I just started writing. And then Bernard Cornwell brought out the Last Kingdom, the first novel in the Uhtred stories, and I hadn't finished the novel at this point. And my book starts in Bebbanburg. His book started in Bebbanburg. It's a young warrior. It's a young warrior. I was like, oh my god, this guy, and I stopped writing. I didn't write for 7 years. I just threw it away and said, that's it, I can't write now, because everyone's going to say that I've copied him. And even to this day, people say, oh, you've just copied Bernard Cornwell. It's like, but in the end, I just thought, oh, this is crazy. When the self-publishing boom came along, I thought, I can self-publish. If I don't get a publishing deal, I can just self-publish. I should write these books, at least the first one, and see how it goes. And then as it happened, I ended up getting a publishing deal and doing well. But yeah, so I think really yes, I've read lots of historical fiction, but I'm kind of surprised that I fell into the historical fiction genre. I think if you'd asked me when I was 20, if you'd come back in time and said you're going to be a writer, what are you going to write? I would have said I'd be writing fantasy, because I was massively into fantasy then. And I've got all these history books here. I've had to buy. I failed history at school. I failed history and I failed English literature at school. So I would have passed Dungeons and Dragons. If there was an exam in that, I would have passed that. I'll tell you. But
yeah, it's funny though, because I've honestly heard that so many times throughout my life from different writers that like just didn't click with writing or reading when they were younger, and it just wasn't a thing. And then they've gone on to become just amazing writers. And I think personally, that storytelling kind of transcends the academic that way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I did read a lot, but I couldn't, and I still can't really enjoy reading a story that I don't enjoy. And the whole thing of studying English literature at school is you have to read 10 books that you hate. And it's like, well, why am I going to do that when I could be playing Dungeons and Dragons or down the pub or going out with girls or whatever? So I'm just not interested in that. So I was off, singing in a band or down the pub getting drunk or something. I didn't want to do it. And history, I think, was a bit the same, really, as well. You have to study certain events in history. You have to go through all this stuff, and you study it very much from a politics standpoint. It's all about, the politics of it. And I didn't really find that interesting. It wasn't very, it's not stories, it wasn't stories about the people. It was just about, I don't know, it felt very distant to me. I could never really get into it.
Yeah, I had that same problem because I was an English major with a theater minor, so I took a lot of the theater history classes and all that kind of stuff, and had to read all of the old Greek plays and all the way up to Death of a Salesman and all that kind of stuff. And it was the same. I mean, it helped me in the sense that I became more aware of what and why I didn't like, what I didn't like and why I didn't like things in don't get me started on Great Gatsby or anything like that. So in that sense, I think it was a good thing. But I had the same experience where after I graduated, I just didn't want to read anything, because it was, like when you're forced into so much of reading that you don't enjoy. Yeah, it can definitely.
Yeah, I took the other side. Joy. I just didn't do it. I failed. I failed all the exams because I just didn't do it. So I'm not going to do it. But I know exactly what you're saying. My wife did a degree, relatively recently, like sort of 10 years ago, and she's in librarianship, and she's now an academic librarian. But part of her end of degree project that she had, her dissertation, was that she'd come up with, but it's all about librarians in literature and in fantasy literature and stuff. So she had to create this list of I don't know how many novels, and she read them all, and it was like 30, 50 novels or something. I don't know how many novels. And she reads really fast, but afterwards she just didn't read a novel for like about 2 years afterwards.
That's different than choosing to read 30 or 50 novels in a year or however long it was. Yeah.
And normally you choose books that you want to read, right? But this wasn't. It was just, I'm going to read this book to see that and then talk about it in this dissertation. And I think she regretted the decision of how to, what she was going to study. But forcing yourself to read so many books, I think. I saw recently on your channel, you said that you've read, 66 books
last year.
So that's crazy. I mean, I never read that many books, but probably the most I've ever read in a year was probably about 25, and that was when I was probably working full time and commuting.
You probably retain a lot more of what you read than I do.
Maybe.
But I definitely, and I mentioned this in a video I have coming out tomorrow, that I am kind of trying to take a step back, and because one of the things with and I won't get into this much, but one of the things with BookTube is you kind of are like, once you're stuck with the content creation side of reading, then you're trying to read this book and get out the review and do all the things, and so just try to get to the next book. And it's kind of like that with academics too. You're trying to quick finish this book before the deadline, write your essay or whatever it is you have to do for it, and then get on to the next thing so you can get through this big list. And so, I think there's a whole conversation around writing what you or reading what you enjoy, and just trying to make that a fun experience. And Wolf of Essex was my first read of 2023. And I had read a ton of fantasy, and I was like, you know what? I've been staring at this book. I love this cover. so much. I've been staring at this book for 2 months. I'm going to pick it up, and this is just going to be a fun start to the year that's not fantasy, and it's, you know, something different. And yeah, I loved it. It was a great way to start the year. And I was really excited at the end that you were on Twitter, because I was like, oh, I get to talk to him now.
Well, it was great, and it's always lovely to get someone contacting you on Twitter out of the blue and saying, "I've read your book and I enjoyed it." That's always nice, because and it's nice to say you like the cover. Well,
I was gonna just ask if you would show everybody the axe.
I will show you the axe,
so
but
cool.
I'll tell you a bit about the axe as well. I'll actually take off the scabbard off the axe as well. So I don't know if you can see that here. Look, this is the axe that's on the cover.
That is
both
so
sides
beautiful.
embossed. There's actually runes all along the actual hilt of it, or shaft, haft, and leather wrappings.
Gorgeous.
These Viking runes actually mean something. I can't remember what they mean now, but I came up with this sort of design with a guy called Chris Bailey, and we just, so he's actually the guy who runs the Benicia Chronicles, the Bernard Cornwell fan club on Facebook. And so I was on there, and I saw he was doing some axes for people, basically buying a relatively cheap sort of reproduction axe, but then personalizing them, carving the wood and doing stuff. And so I contacted him. I said, I've got this idea for this axe in this story. I'd like to do something. And we just started talking back and forth. And there's on my whatchamacallit, I can't think of the word, on my website. There's that's the word. I wrote a post all about it on my blog on my website. There's a blog post all about it there, and how we came up with the design, and he did it all. So he did the whole thing, and he'd never done that sort of engraving before in the blade, and he did all of that. And anyway, and he was like, I don't think I could do it. I was like, yeah, you can do it, it'll be fine. And so he was like buying new tools to do all this stuff. Anyway, he did it all, and it was great. And then at the end of it, you know, I paid for the, I think I paid for the axe and sent it to him. And then I said, well, how much do I owe you? You spent like, you know, weeks doing this thing. And he said, no, nothing, that's fine, just have it. And he sent it to me, and that was it. I was like, man, that's amazing. So obviously he's credited on the, you know, on the cover, and I sent him the book. I sent him a boxed. Actually, I sent him one of these. I think he got a limited.
So
he got
jealous.
a signed limited edition with the book.
Yeah, that is beautiful.
Which that was a gift for him as well. So that was yeah, but it was great. And then the photo on the cover of the actual axe was taken by my daughter, my youngest daughter, Iona.
Cool.
So because the publishers didn't want to use the axe, they wanted to do something else. They had like some idea of a guy in a forest, and I was like, I think this thing would work with the axe.
This is an awesome cover. Like, I love, and I'm a sucker for beautiful hardcovers. So like the foil and everything, just, it's so perfect. It's beautiful.
So you have to open it up and show people the color map as well inside of it, if it's got, look at this.
Oh, yes, as fantasy enthusiasts, my audience are in
the style of the Tolkien maps, basically.
Yeah, I love a good map.
Pretty cool. So I said to them, no, I think you should do this, just the axe. I've got this axe, and they were like, oh, I'm not sure. They've been through a couple of iterations of the cover, and then I just said, look, I'll send you a photo of it and see what you can mock up. And so I literally hung a green sheet over the shower rail in the bathroom, and I held it. My daughter took a photo on her iPhone, and we just sent that. So it's just a green screen, basically, with the thing. Sent it to them. And then they came up with that, and there was a couple of iterations of like what the forest should look like behind, because I said it's the wrong type of trees, and they said, yeah, but this is the other alternative, and the other alternative looked crap, so we went with the wrong type of trees in the end. But I said,
you know what?
It looks good. It looks good. But you know, there's a moment as a writer. There's a moment when you get asked, like, do you like this cover? Is it again? Like, no, the trees, the wrong type of trees.
The trees are not right.
Yeah.
Well, it is a beautiful cover, and I'm glad that that they use the axe, because I mean, covers with guys on the front, with the character on the front, can look amazing, and I always love those. But after you've seen so many.
It's
cool to have something unique like that on the cover.
Yeah, something a bit different, and I wanted it to be unique. So the axe, I knew the axe was unique.
Yeah.
I thought, well, we've designed the axe, me and Chris, and we put it. He's created the thing. So I know it's unique. So nobody else is going to have the same cover.
Yeah. That's my husband watching in the other room.
Thanks, Benjamin.
Yeah, so you had also showed me before we went live, you showed me that a fan sent you a gift that you were going to possibly show off during this as well, that I thought was pretty cool.
I've got just one of them here, but I got sent these miniatures. I don't know if I can hold it somewhere where you can actually see it. I don't know. Oh, bang my microphone. Can you see that? Is it?
Yeah, if you put your hand, I think if you maybe put your hand behind it, maybe. Because I know these cameras like to. There you go. That's a little bit better.
Is that a bit better? Oh well, it's not great, is it? I don't know where its focal point is, but anyway, I think it's just focusing on my face, isn't it? It's anyway very detailed, 25mm. Like basically role-playing figures, but they're Anglo-Saxon warriors, and he sent me like I don't know like a dozen of these, and they've all got the black shield.
That's some real fan art right there.
Bearbrand has got a black shield, and all of his warriors, they're sort of known as the Black Shields, because at one point in the book they say, what emblem should we have on the shields, and he says, let's just have black, because.
Sorry, my children are always in the background.
That's all right. That's okay. How many children have you got?
I have 3. My oldest is 10. He's obsessed with Brian Jake's Redwall series right now.
Okay.
And then 2 daughters, 7 and 5. So in about 10 years, I will be Dunstan.
Okay. Yeah. You can be walking around the fields with a dog.
Right. Exactly. Maybe my cats. I have 2 cats.
Walk around with the cats, like lions.
Yeah, exactly.
Panthers or something.
I'll get a tiger.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
So what's to kind of close up? What is coming next for you? You kind of talked about that a little bit at the beginning, but what are we looking at in the next year plus here for you coming out with books?
Okay, so we've got this. We've got this historical fiction new standalone that I'm writing this year, which is a real departure. So I'm a little bit worried about it, but I've written. I was talking to you beforehand saying I've only written one novella, but I've actually written another novella, which is actually set in the same world, I guess, as this new novel I'm going to write, and that's on my Patreon actually. So if anyone's really, really interested and you want to go in there, you can sign up to the I think the second tier or whatever. You can read that novella. It's on there in like sort of 10 bits. But anyway, so I've written a novella in that period, so that's going to be interesting. But it's a departure, and I'm sort of worried that it's going to, I'm going to spend a year of my life writing it, and then nobody's going to read it.
Kind of an experiment.
We will find out. My publishers said like, you've wanted to write something, you wanted to write this for a while. Just go ahead, do it, see how it goes. Which was nice.
Well, and it might be something where, like, your fan base at first might be like, oh, that's a completely different direction, but give it a few years and then everybody will love it.
Well, we'll see.
If hopefully, not now, because I'm very interested to see like what time period you're choosing and all of that. So I'm excited.
I think the clues are out there in what I've said already, but we'll see. And then of course after that I'm writing the 10th of the Benicia Chronicles, which is Bearbrand finally getting to Rome. And then I guess if things go well after that, there'll be more Bearbrand stories in the Benicia Chronicles, because I'll need to at some point write to the culmination at least of where I think it's going to culminate. And if the Hunlaf A Time for Swords books go well, at the moment they're doing well. I've just sold the rights to the first 3 to be translated into Spanish, and the first one's been translated into Czech, I think. So there's sort of like unusual. So there's sort of a bit of movement of people, different countries buying the rights, and if that continues, I'm sure that I'll be asked to write some more of those. One of the things that I've done with that is to my publisher said, why don't you have him traveling around, more? Because then when you go to other countries, it's easier to sell the rights to that country if they travel to that country. And it's interesting because this third one, A Day of Reckoning, I've got him, Hunlaf and his motley crew, travel down to Islamic Spain in the late 8th century. And funnily enough, the Spanish publisher then said, "Oh, we'll buy the 3 books." Yeah.
So the rest of the series will just be Hunlaf traveling to everywhere.
Yeah, that's it. It's like, where's next? What's the biggest readership? Okay, Germany. So he's going to be in Germany next, and then he'll travel over to America and Japan. It'll be just traveling everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't even think about that, but I suppose that makes sense.
So yeah, more historical fiction, and if this standalone that I write this year does surprisingly well, there may be more of this new time period as well. But we will see. It's an itch that I need to scratch, and
try something
we'll see
new.
what comes from it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that's really cool to, I was talking to authors and I love hearing how they're expanding and, pushing and challenging themselves in different directions. So I think that's really awesome that you're still like looking for, that new experience in writing. And I mean, because you've got 13, this is your 13th book, the next one, right?
The one I'm just finishing now, yes, the 13th. So I'm writing the 14th now. And in fact, I just thought there's got another thing. I've forgotten about it because I wrote it so long ago and it hasn't been published yet. But I've written like a long short story. It's like, I don't know, like 10,000, 12,000 words. So it's not a tiny story for Warhammer 40,000.
Oh, okay.
And I wrote that, but I literally wrote it in 2020. So I've forgotten about it. I wrote it so long ago. So that's my first, something outside of historical fiction.
Yeah.
And I've never played Warhammer 40K. So it was basically, I had to research. It was more difficult to write than historical fiction. There was so much stuff. I would send it in. More. They'd send me they say here's like an encyclopedia about Warhammer 40K, and I'm like, okay. And then there's like all these sort of Wikipedia pages. They've got like the Lexicanum or whatever it's called, and it's like, I'd write this stuff and I'd send it. And they go, you can't use that type of tank there. It's got. I was like, what? That's okay. And so that was very interesting.
I hadn't even heard of Warhammer 40K until about a month ago, to be honest.
Oh, with the whole Henry Cavill thing.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Because it just came up and everybody was talking about it. And my friend Patricia Meredith in the comments, her husband Andrew, who's also a fantasy author, he is a big fan of it and knows all of the things. And just hearing him and a couple of my other friends talking about it, I was like, it's just a massive,
it's huge. There's just there's so many novels, so many short stories, so many novellas, so many everything, games, books as well, all this stuff. It's a massive universe. But so yeah, they contacted me, and it was right in the middle of lockdown of 2020, and they said, would you like to write something? And at that point I was terrified that the world was going to end, and I was never going to be able to write again. I didn't really know what was happening, so I thought, I'm not going to say no to anything. So I said, yeah, fine, I'll do that. And I spent like 2 weeks doing the research, and then like 2 weeks writing this short story, and then it must have literally months of editing. I mean, it was like ridiculous. The number it went like through 3 or 4 rounds of edits, and by the end of it I was totally fed up with it. But I think it's okay, and they haven't published it, and I don't know what's happening now. And they said, oh, this year, maybe in summer, it's going to come out in some, I don't know, ebook form or something. But anyway, you follow me on Twitter now, so you'll find out when it comes out.
I will
if it comes out. They've paid me for it, so if it doesn't come out, it's a bit disappointing. But hopefully they'll release it at some stage. But it's called, I'm not supposed to say the title, but it's called The Whispering Blade.
Okay, well, they didn't hear it from me.
They didn't hear it. Yeah, they didn't hear it from me. I never said it. Yeah, so they probably won't publish it now. They'll say that I breached some sort of IP and thing. And
yeah, well, then you can self-publish it whenever they're.
Yeah, they'll change all the IP to something else. Anyway, hopefully it will come out this year, and that will be an interesting thing.
Well, that's a definite step away
fan base. Yeah,
that's a definite step away from AD 800 British Isles.
Yeah. So it's all las guns and stuff. Yeah, but I still managed to get a knife into it or a sword or something.
Of course. I've got to. Yeah, I'm notorious for that in video games that are first-person shooters. If there is any kind of blade weapon anywhere, I will find it and I will throw out the gun and I will pick that up instead.
It'll be like taking people down with the katana. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for coming on my channel and for doing the interview. I love getting a chance to chat with the authors that I've been able to read, and I really loved Wolf of Wessex. So anybody who watches this video, huge recommendation from me. If you're looking for a historical fiction standalone, Wolf of Wessex is excellent, and I will definitely be picking up another of your books in the near future. So thank you so much for jumping on.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you ever so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And always nice to talk about books and writing and all things literary, I guess.
Yeah.
So thanks very much.
Yeah, I'm sure it won't be the last time we chat.
Yeah, I'll be happy to come back on again. Talk to you when there's new ones, new standalone comes out.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out on your Twitter for the new releases, and we will chat some more.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Thank you guys so much. And yeah, we will see you in the next video. Bye, guys.
Bye.